They called his garden too small, until it fed 12 people for an entire year. You know, there's something most people don't understand about growing food. We've been taught to think you need acres and acres of land, expensive equipment, maybe a tractor or two. We look at those massive commercial farms stretching to the horizon and think that's the only way to really feed people. But what if I told you that everything you've been led to believe about food production is wrong? This is the story of a man who proved that with the right knowledge, dedication, and a complete rejection of conventional thinking, you can achieve what most agricultural experts would call impossible. This isn't some fairy tale. This is about real dirt, real sweat, and a small piece of land that became something extraordinary. Let me take you back to a time when America was different. Not better, not worse, just different. The early 20th century, before supermarkets became temples of convenience, before we started measuring success by how little time we spent thinking about where our food came from. Back then, particularly during the World Wars and the Great Depression, Americans had to be resourceful. They had to be creative. They had no choice. During World War I, the government launched something called the National War Garden Commission. They asked Americans to plant victory gardens to reduce pressure on the food supply needed for troops overseas, and Americans responded. By 1918, these gardens were producing over 1 million tons of vegetables. 1 million tons, from backyard plots, vacant lots, and small parcels of land that today we'd probably just pave over for parking. But here's where it gets interesting. After the war ended, most people went back to buying their food. The victory gardens faded away, became memories, stories grandparents told, except for some people. There were individuals who looked at what they'd accomplished during those years and realized they'd stumbled onto something profound. They'd discovered that the relationship between land size and food production wasn't what they'd been told. Fast forward to the Great Depression. Suddenly, millions of Americans found themselves hungry again, and those victory gardens came roaring back. By 1934, families across the nation were growing food in every available space: front yards, backyards, community plots. But most of these gardens were small, very small by farming standards. We're talking about plots that ranged from a few hundred square feet to maybe a quarter acre at most. Now, agricultural experts of the time would tell you that feeding a family year-round from such a small space was impractical at best, impossible at worst. The conventional wisdom said you needed at least an acre per person to produce enough food. Do the math on that. For a family of 12, you'd need 12 acres. That's a substantial farm, not a garden. But there were people who didn't listen to the conventional wisdom. People who looked at their small plots of land and saw potential instead of limitations. People who understood something that modern agriculture has largely forgotten. It's not about the size of the space, it's about how you use it. Let me tell you about intensive gardening methods that were being refined during this period. French market gardeners, particularly in Paris, had been practicing something called French intensive gardening since the 1800s. These gardeners were feeding the entire city of Paris from relatively small plots of land on the outskirts. We're talking about operations that produced up to 9 harvests per year from the same soil. 9 harvests. How did they do it? Deep soil preparation, heavy composting, close plant spacing, and succession planting. They built up their soil with so much organic matter that it became like a sponge, holding nutrients and water perfectly. They planted crops so close together that the leaves touched when mature, creating a living mulch that retained moisture and prevented weeds. They never let a square inch go unused. When one crop finished, another went in immediately. But the French weren't the only ones who figured this out. In China, farmers had been practicing intensive agriculture for thousands of years. They had to. With massive populations and limited arable land, they developed techniques that made every square foot count. Companion planting, where different crops support each other. Vertical growing, using trellises and poles to maximize space. Interplanting, where fast-growing crops fill the spaces between slower-growing ones. These weren't theoretical concepts. These were proven, time-tested methods that had fed civilizations for centuries. But in America, with its vast prairies and seemingly endless farmland, these intensive methods were largely forgotten or dismissed as unnecessary, until circumstances forced people to remember. During the 1930s and 1940s, there were individuals across America who combined these old-world intensive methods with American ingenuity and determination. They took small plots, sometimes just a few thousand square feet, and turned them into food production powerhouses. They proved that with the right approach, you could feed not just yourself, but an extended family from what others called a too-small garden. The key was understanding that a garden could be a three-dimensional space, not just a two-dimensional plot. Pole beans climbing 8 feet high, tomatoes on stakes or cages, producing fruit all the way up, squash and melons trained onto trellises instead of sprawling across the ground. Suddenly, a 10 by 10 foot section wasn't producing food from 100 square feet. It was producing from several hundred cubic feet of space. Succession planting was another critical element. Most amateur gardeners plant everything in spring and harvest in summer and fall. But the serious intensive gardeners understood that you could have crops growing year-round in most American climates. Cool season crops like lettuce, spinach, peas and carrots in spring and fall. Warm season crops like tomatoes, peppers, beans and squash in summer. Cold hardy crops like kale, collards and certain varieties of lettuce even through winter in many regions, especially with simple cold frames or row covers. Let's talk about soil. This is where most people fail before they even start. They take their hard, compacted yard soil, maybe mix in a bag of potting soil from the store, and wonder why their plants struggle. The intensive gardeners understood that soil isn't just dirt. Soil is a living ecosystem, a complex community of bacteria, fungi, insects, and organic matter all working together. The most successful small-space gardeners built their soil aggressively. They composted everything: kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, grass clippings, animal manure when they could get it. They understood that compost wasn't just fertilizer, it was soil transformation. A well-made compost pile could turn a cubic yard of waste into black gold that would transform struggling clay or sandy soil into rich, friable earth that plants absolutely thrived in. Some of these gardeners built raised beds, which gave them even more control over soil quality. A raised bed 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 1 foot deep contains about 32 cubic feet of soil. Fill that with a perfect mix of compost, peat moss or coconut coir, and minerals, and you've created an ideal growing environment. With intensive spacing, a single bed like that could produce hundreds of pounds of food per year. But it wasn't just about technique, it was about timing, observation, and relentless attention to detail. The most productive gardens were tended daily. Not for hours necessarily, but for focused periods where the gardener walked through, observed, harvested what was ready, planted what needed to go in, addressed problems before they became disasters. Pest management was another crucial skill. Without modern pesticides, these gardeners had to be smart. They used companion planting, where strong-smelling herbs like basil and marigolds confused or repelled pests. They encouraged beneficial insects like ladybugs and lacewings that ate aphids and other plant-damaging bugs. They hand-picked larger pests like tomato hornworms and squash bugs. They used physical barriers like row covers to protect young plants. Water management was critical too. Many of these intensive gardens were established during periods of drought or water rationing. The gardeners learned to mulch heavily, covering the soil surface with straw, leaves, or grass clippings to prevent evaporation. They learned which crops were most drought-tolerant. They learned to water deeply but infrequently, encouraging plants to develop deep root systems that could access moisture lower in the soil profile. And they saved seeds. This is something we've largely lost in modern times, but it was essential back then. When you found a tomato variety that produced exceptionally well in your specific microclimate, you saved those seeds. You selected for the traits you wanted: productivity, disease resistance, flavor. Over years, your garden varieties became adapted to your exact conditions, performing better than any store-bought seeds ever could. Food preservation was the final piece of the puzzle. Growing enough food to feed 12 people for a year means producing a massive amount during the growing season. But fresh tomatoes in July don't help you in January unless you preserve them. These gardeners became experts at canning, drying, fermenting, and root cellaring. Tomatoes became sauce, paste, and juice canned in mason jars. Green beans were blanched and canned or pickled, Corn was blanched and cut off the cob, then frozen or dried. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Cucumbers became pickles of every variety. Carrots, beets, and potatoes were stored in cool, dark root cellars where they'd keep for months. Apples and pears were dried or made into preserves. Beans were dried on the vine for winter protein. A well-stocked pantry and root cellar from a productive garden was a thing of beauty. Rows of colorful jars glinting in lamplight, bins of potatoes, carrots, and beets, braids of onions and garlic hanging from rafters, dried beans in containers. This was food security. This was independence. Let me give you some specific numbers because I know you're wondering about the actual math. Research from various agricultural universities over the years has shown that an intensive garden of just 4,000 square feet, less than 1/10 of an acre, can produce enough vegetables to feed a family of 4 for a year. That's assuming decent soil, good technique, and succession planting. But 4,000 square feet is approximately a 63-foot by 63-foot plot. That's a good-sized backyard in many suburban homes. Now scale that up slightly for a family of 12, and you're talking about maybe 12,000 to 15,000 square feet. That's still less than half an acre. Most people hearing that a garden was too small to feed 12 would assume we were talking about something far smaller. The reality is that most people vastly underestimate what's possible in a relatively small space. Modern studies of urban agriculture and intensive organic farming have confirmed what those Depression-era gardeners already knew. With the right techniques, you can produce 50,000 to 100,000 pounds of food per acre per year. Let that sink in. 1 acre, 100,000 pounds of food. That's not industrial farming with massive machinery. That's intensive technique, hand cultivation, and deep knowledge. Consider this. The average American eats about 1,800 pounds of food per year. For 12 people, that's 21,600 pounds. If you're producing 50,000 pounds per acre with intensive methods, you need less than half an acre to feed 12 people. Suddenly, a small garden doesn't seem so small anymore. But here's what most people miss when they hear stories like this. They think it's about the technique alone. Plant things close together, compost a lot, and boom, food abundance. But that's not the full picture. The real story is about a complete paradigm shift in how you think about food and self-sufficiency. The people who succeeded at this, who really fed their families year-round from small plots, they weren't just gardeners. They were observers of natural systems. They understood that a garden is an ecosystem, and the more you work with natural processes instead of against them, the more productive and resilient that ecosystem becomes. They understood that diversity was strength. A garden with 30 different crops is far less vulnerable to disease, pests, or weather than a monoculture field. If the tomatoes failed, there were still beans, squash, peppers, lettuce, carrots, beets, and dozens of other crops. They spread their risk across the entire spectrum of edible plants. They understood cycles. Nitrogen-fixing legumes like beans and peas don't just produce food, they actually improve the soil for the next crop. Heavy feeders like tomatoes and corn take a lot out of the soil, so you follow them with light feeders or cover crops that rebuild fertility. Everything connects. Everything has a purpose beyond just the immediate harvest. They understood that a garden feeds more than just humans. Flowers attract pollinators, which are essential for fruit set in many crops. Birds eat harmful insects. Toads and snakes control slugs and grubs. A healthy garden is a living community where every organism has a role. These gardeners also understood season extension in ways that modern suburban homeowners rarely consider. A simple cold frame, which is basically a bottomless box with a glass or plastic top, can extend your growing season by weeks or even months on both ends. In many parts of the United States, you can grow lettuce, spinach, and other greens right through winter with basic protection. Some built more elaborate structures, hoop houses covered with plastic sheeting, attached greenhouses that borrowed heat from the house, root cellars dug into hillsides or built into basements, maintaining that perfect cool, humid environment where many vegetables and fruits could be stored for months. They understood microclimates too. The south-facing wall of a building stays warmer and can support crops that might not otherwise thrive in your climate. A low spot in the yard might be prone to frost, but perfect for moisture-loving crops in summer. Rocky soil on a slope might be terrible for most vegetables, but perfect for herbs that prefer good drainage. Let's talk about the psychological aspect of this kind of intensive food production. Because it's not just about feeding the body, it's about feeding the soul in ways that modern consumer culture has tried to make us forget. There's something profound that happens when you eat food you grew yourself. It's not just about nutrition or even flavor, though homegrown vegetables at peak ripeness are in a completely different league than anything you'll buy at a store. It's about connection. Connection to the seasons, to the weather, to the soil, to natural cycles that human beings were intimately familiar with for thousands of years until very recently. When you grow your food, you can't ignore nature. You can't pretend you're separate from the natural world. You're in it, working with it, depending on it, learning from it every single day. There's also a confidence that comes from knowing you can feed yourself and your family, regardless of what's happening in the economy, regardless of supply chain disruptions, regardless of anything beyond your control. That's real security, not the false security of a bank account that could disappear in a financial crisis. The people who mastered small space-intensive food production during hard times often reported that working in their gardens was meditative, therapeutic even. In an era of massive uncertainty and hardship, the garden was a place where cause and effect were clear, where hard work and knowledge produced visible, tangible results, where you could create beauty and abundance, even when the world outside your fence seemed to be falling apart. Now, I want to address something important. This isn't about romanticizing poverty or hardship. The people who had to feed 12 people from a small garden weren't doing it for fun. They were doing it because they had no other choice. Economic circumstances, war rationing, or simple geographic isolation meant that self-sufficiency wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was survival. But here's the thing. They discovered something valuable in that necessity. They discovered capabilities they didn't know they had. They discovered that the mainstream narrative about what's possible was wrong. They discovered that with knowledge, effort, and determination, they could do things that experts said couldn't be done. And some of them, even when circumstances improved, chose to continue. They'd tasted real food. They'd experienced real independence. They'd developed skills and knowledge that gave them confidence and purpose. Why would they give that up to become passive consumers again? Let's consider what these gardens typically included, because the diversity is impressive. Tomatoes, obviously, in multiple varieties, slicing, paste, and cherry types. Peppers, both sweet and hot. Multiple types of beans, pole beans, bush beans, dried beans. Squash in summer and winter varieties. Cucumbers. Lettuce and other salad greens in multiple varieties for succession planting. Carrots, beets, turnips, radishes. Onions, both storage types and green onions. Garlic, potatoes. Sweet potatoes in suitable climates. Corn, often in a small patch but bred for eating fresh, drying, or both. Cruciferous vegetables, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, leafy greens, chard kale, collards, spinach. Herbs for cooking and medicine, basil, oregano, thyme, sage, parsley, cilantro. Fruits where space allowed. Strawberries as ground cover, raspberries and blackberries along fences, dwarf or espaliered fruit trees. That's 40 or 50 different crops in many of these gardens, each with its own requirements, its own season, its own method of preservation. Managing all that requires serious organizational skills and knowledge. You need to know when to start seeds indoors, when to transplant, when each crop will be ready, what needs to go in immediately after harvest, how to preserve each type of produce, and how to store everything properly. These gardeners kept records. They knew that their tomatoes did best planted in mid-May, that their fall carrots needed to be planted by August 1st to size up before frost. That succession planting lettuce every 2 weeks from March through May, and again from August through September, gave them fresh salads for 8 months of the year. They learned from failures and refined their successes. Water systems were often ingenious. Some collected rainwater from roofs in barrels. Some diverted grey water from washing to the garden. Some built simple irrigation systems using gravity and repurposed materials. In the Southwest, some adopted traditional Native American techniques like sunken gardens that captured and held moisture in arid conditions. Composting systems evolved over time. Many gardeners had multiple compost piles at different stages of decomposition. Fresh materials went into the active pile. The aging pile was breaking down. The finished pile was ready to use. This rotation meant they always had finished compost available when they needed it. Some gardeners kept chickens, which provided both eggs and nitrogen-rich manure for the garden. The chickens would eat kitchen scraps and garden waste, converting it into high-quality fertilizer. Some had rabbits, which also produced excellent manure and provided meat. These small-scale integrated animal systems made the gardens even more productive and self-sufficient. Tool maintenance was crucial. Without money to constantly replace tools, these gardeners took care of what they had. Shovels, hoes, rakes, and hand tools were cleaned after use, sharpened regularly, and oiled to prevent rust. A well-maintained tool could last decades. Many gardeners were using tools that had belonged to their parents or grandparents. The knowledge these gardeners accumulated was impressive. They could look at a plant and diagnose nutrient deficiencies from the color and pattern of leaf yellowing. They could predict weather by observing cloud patterns and animal behavior. They knew which weeds were edible and nutritious. They knew dozens of traditional remedies for common ailments, many made from herbs they grew. This knowledge was passed down within families and communities. Children grew up working in the garden alongside parents and grandparents, absorbing years of accumulated wisdom. Neighbors shared tips, traded seeds, helped each other during critical times like harvest. There was a culture around food production that has largely disappeared from modern American life. Community gardens and shared plots were common. A neighborhood might have several families working adjacent plots, sharing tools, knowledge, and sometimes produce. This created social bonds and mutual support networks that extended far beyond just food production. People looked out for each other, helped each other, celebrated successes, and mourned failures together. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This all sounds great, but it's not realistic for modern life. We have jobs, we have responsibilities. We can't spend all day every day in a garden like people did during the Depression. And you're right to a point. Most people today can't or won't dedicate that level of time and effort to food production. But here's what's interesting. You don't need to replicate the extreme end of intensive food production to gain significant benefits. Even a small garden, a few raised beds totaling maybe 200 square feet, can produce hundreds of pounds of vegetables in a season if managed well. That's real food, real nutrition, and real savings on the grocery bill. It's also a tangible connection to your food source and a skill set that has value beyond just the immediate harvest. The lessons from these intensive gardens of the past are more relevant now than they've been in decades. We're seeing increasing concerns about food security, about supply chain reliability, about the environmental impact of industrial agriculture, about the nutritional quality of mass-produced food. People are starting to ask questions about where their food comes from and whether there might be better ways. Urban agriculture is experiencing a renaissance. Rooftop gardens, vertical farms, community gardens, even commercial urban farms are producing significant amounts of food in cities. These modern efforts are often using the same intensive techniques that those Depression-era gardeners pioneered. Deep soil building, companion planting, succession planting, season extension, integrated pest management. Some modern urban farms are producing even more than their historical counterparts because they're combining traditional techniques with modern knowledge and materials. Drip irrigation systems that deliver water with perfect efficiency. Row covers made from advanced fabrics that let light through while protecting from pests and cold. Varieties bred specifically for intensive production in small spaces. Soil testing that allows precise nutrient management. But the fundamental principles remain the same. Maximize every square foot, build healthy soil, work with nature instead of against it, observe and adapt, preserve the harvest, close the loop by composting and recycling nutrients. There's something else worth considering. The people who fed their families from small gardens during hard times weren't just producing calories. They were producing health. Fresh vegetables and fruits, grown in rich organic soil, harvested at peak ripeness, and eaten within hours or days, are nutritionally superior to anything you'll find in a supermarket. The vitamin content of many vegetables begins declining the moment they're harvested. When your food travels thousands of miles and sits in storage for weeks, you're not getting the same nutritional benefit. Home gardens also provide food diversity that's hard to find commercially. There are thousands of varieties of tomatoes, but supermarkets carry maybe 5 or 6 types. There are hundreds of varieties of beans, but most stores sell 2 or 3. A serious home gardener can grow unique varieties that offer different flavors, textures, and nutritional profiles than anything commercially available. Heirloom varieties in particular often offer superior flavor and nutrition compared to modern hybrid varieties bred primarily for shipping durability and shelf life rather than taste. Many of the Depression-era gardeners were growing varieties that dated back a century or more, varieties that had been saved and passed down through generations because they performed well and tasted great. The mental and physical health benefits of gardening are well documented. Regular physical activity in the fresh air, stress reduction from working with plants, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and productive, the meditative quality of repetitive tasks like weeding or harvesting. For many people who fed their families from small gardens, the garden was as much about mental health and well-being as it was about physical nutrition. There's also an educational aspect that's often overlooked. Children who grow up helping in a productive garden learn countless valuable lessons. They learn that food doesn't just appear in stores, it comes from seed, soil, water, and work. They learn patience as they wait for plants to mature. They learn responsibility as they understand that plants need consistent care. They learn about biology, ecology, and natural systems in a hands-on way that no textbook can match. These children often develop healthier eating habits too. Kids who grow vegetables are far more likely to eat vegetables. When a child has watched a tomato plant grow from a tiny seedling, cared for it, and finally harvested that first ripe fruit, they have a connection to that tomato that makes them actually want to eat it. It's not just food, it's their accomplishment. The economic impact of a productive home garden can be substantial. Various studies have shown that a well-managed garden can produce $3 to $5 of vegetables for every dollar spent on seeds, soil amendments, and supplies. For a family actively gardening a modest plot, that can translate to saving hundreds or even thousands of dollars per year on groceries. But beyond the direct savings, there's the value of food security. When you have a pantry full of preserved food from your garden, you're not as vulnerable to food price fluctuations, supply disruptions, or personal financial setbacks. You have a buffer, a reserve that gives you options and peace of mind. The environmental benefits are significant too. No transportation emissions from food that travels 0 miles from garden to table, no packaging waste, no pesticides or herbicides if you garden organically. Composting kitchen and yard waste instead of sending it to landfills where it produces methane. Building soil carbon instead of depleting it, as industrial agriculture does. Creating habitat for pollinators and other beneficial insects. A network of home gardens in a neighborhood or community creates green corridors that support biodiversity. Birds, bees, butterflies, and other wildlife benefit from the flowers, shelter, and food that gardens provide. This is particularly important in suburban areas that might otherwise be biological deserts of lawns and ornamental landscaping. Let's circle back to the original premise. Someone was told their garden was too small to feed 12 people for a year, and they proved the critics wrong. This happened not once but countless times throughout American history, particularly during periods of economic hardship and war. The specifics varied, the exact techniques evolved, but the fundamental truth remained. With knowledge, dedication, and the right approach, a relatively small piece of land can produce an astonishing amount of food. These weren't miracles, these weren't flukes. These were the predictable results of applying proven intensive gardening techniques, building excellent soil, managing the space carefully, and preserving the harvest properly. The only thing miraculous about it was that mainstream agriculture had convinced people it was impossible when it had actually been standard practice in many cultures for thousands of years. The modern food system wants us to believe we're dependent on it, that we need massive industrial farms, complex supply chains, and supermarkets to survive. And for most people in modern urban society, that's functionally true at this point. We've lost the knowledge and skills our grandparents took for granted. We've lost the infrastructure, like root cellars and pantries designed for food storage. We've lost the culture of food preservation and self-sufficiency. But we don't have to stay lost. The knowledge is still out there. The techniques still work. The seeds are still available, though we have to seek out good sources. The fundamental biology of plants and soil hasn't changed. What grew food in 1935 will grow food today. This isn't about everyone becoming a full-time subsistence farmer. It's about reclaiming some agency over one of the most fundamental aspects of human life, what we eat. It's about understanding that the conventional wisdom about what's possible is often wrong. It's about learning to see potential where others see limitations. When someone says your garden is too small, what they're really saying is that they don't understand what's possible with the right approach. They're thinking in terms of conventional, extensive agriculture where you need space and machinery. They're not thinking about intensive methods, vertical growing, succession planting, season extension, and all the other techniques that maximize production from limited space. The gardens that fed 12 people, that produced thousands of pounds of food from plots measured in thousands of square feet rather than acres, they stand as proof of concept. They show us what human ingenuity and determination can accomplish when necessity demands it. They show us that the relationship between us and our food can be direct, personal and empowering rather than distant, commercial and passive. These gardens also represent a kind of quiet rebellion against the industrialization and commodification of everything, including food. They represent people saying, I can do this myself. I don't need to be entirely dependent on systems beyond my control. I have skills, knowledge, and agency. That's a powerful statement, especially in times of uncertainty. The legacy of these intensive gardens lives on in various forms today. Urban farming initiatives in cities across America, school gardens teaching children where food comes from, community gardens bringing neighbors together, the growing interest in permaculture and regenerative agriculture, the rise of farmers' markets and local food movements. All of these, in various ways, are echoing the lessons learned by those who fed their families from small gardens during hard times. We live in a time of abundance compared to the Depression era, but also a time of increasing concern about the sustainability and resilience of our food systems. Climate change is affecting agriculture. Water scarcity is a growing issue in many regions. Soil degradation from industrial farming is a serious problem. The environmental and health costs of industrial agriculture are becoming impossible to ignore. In this context, the lessons from small space-intensive food production are more relevant than ever. We need to produce more food on less land using fewer resources, building soil rather than depleting it, working with nature rather than against it. The techniques pioneered and refined by home gardeners feeding their families offer a model for how that might be done. Not everyone will want to grow all their own food, or even most of it. But imagine if even 10 or 20% of American families grew some of their own vegetables in backyard or community gardens. The cumulative impact on food security, public health, environmental sustainability, and community resilience would be enormous. The story of small gardens feeding large families is ultimately a story about human potential. It's about what becomes possible when we question assumptions, apply knowledge creatively, work consistently toward a goal, and refuse to accept limitations that others try to impose on us. It's about the intersection of necessity and ingenuity, producing results that seem impossible until they're actually achieved. These gardeners weren't superhuman. They didn't have access to technology or resources we don't have today. In many cases, they had far less. What they had was knowledge, determination, and no other choice. They had to figure it out, and they did. They took what mainstream agriculture said was too small and made it abundant. They took soil that others said was too poor and built it into something rich and productive. They took climates that others said were too harsh and extended the growing season. And in doing so, they left us a legacy. They left us proof that it can be done. They left us techniques and knowledge that still work today. They left us an example of what's possible when we take responsibility for our own food security rather than outsourcing it entirely to distant systems beyond our control. So the next time someone tells you something is too small, too difficult, or impossible, remember these gardens. Remember the families who ate year-round from plots that agricultural experts said couldn't possibly feed them. Remember that conventional wisdom is often wrong, that expertise without practical experience can be misleading, and that determination combined with knowledge can achieve what skeptics insist is impossible. The gardens that fed 12 people from 2 small spaces weren't anomalies. They were examples of what becomes possible when we work with nature instead of against it. When we maximize intensity instead of just expanding area. When we apply knowledge and observation and effort consistently over time. They show us that the right question isn't, how much land do I need? But rather, how can I make the most of whatever land I have? That's a question with the power to transform not just gardens, but our entire relationship with food, with nature, with self-sufficiency and community resilience. It's a question whose time has come again, as more people recognize that the modern industrial food system, for all its convenience, has costs that may not be sustainable or even acceptable. The small gardens that produced abundance stand as monuments to what's possible. They challenge us to reconsider our assumptions, to question what we've been told is impossible, to explore what we might be capable of if we're willing to learn, work, and persist. They remind us that some of the most important technologies are ancient, simple, and available to anyone willing to get their hands dirty and learn from the soil. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. If you found this story inspiring and informative, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone who might be interested in gardening, self-sufficiency, or American history. Your support helps us continue bringing you content about the amazing things people have accomplished and the lessons we can learn from the past. This video is inspired by real historical events and practices documented throughout American history, particularly during the World Wars and Great Depression era, when intensive home gardens fed millions of families. While the specific story is a representative narrative, the techniques, yields, and principles described are based on actual historical practices and modern agricultural research. This content is not meant to represent any specific individual or to offend anyone.